All right. So I kind of lied a little bit on the topic. I'm going to start out with that. So I said Azure Cloud. And we'll get into the reason why I said Azure Cloud. Most people recognize Azure as Microsoft Cloud Services. There's also M365 and Azure Cloud, and they're different, and we'll discuss why. But before we get there, let's go into the overview, right? So we've got the introduction. Don't really worry about that. We got some concepts. We're going to do unauthenticated recon, and be because it's a pen testing kind of topic, we had to throw some exploitation in there. And then we're going to look at authenticated recon. So there's really two major differences here, right? We can look at the unauthenticated side and what we can see from there once we get that set of credentials, or if you're a security analyst who wants to actually go in and delve more into it with your tenant or a tenant that you're authorized to check against, we've got that authenticated recon piece. And that's what we all do as testers here too. So we'll get there when we do. So a little bit about me. Penetration tester here at Black Hills Information Security, security analyst, lifetime hacker. Been doing it for as long as I can remember. I remember doing things in middle school that were probably a little sketch too. I'm on the CIS Critical Security Controls editor, so the editorial panel for version 8. I worked on the ICS companion guide version 8, and I've got 22 years of experience kind of all over the place. A lot of internet provider, a lot of energy, a little bit of healthcare, and pen testing now. And I always did, pen testing style roles, security roles, as long as I can remember. So goals for the day. I'm not going to read these off because we're going to delve into these, but if you need to go back, slide 4 has got kind of the outline of where we're starting. So I started and said I lied to you just a little bit, right? So we have M365 and we have Azure. And a lot of people just combine them to say Azure, which makes sense from the standpoint of, it's one term that you can use to describe Microsoft Cloud. But it's a little bit tricky when you're thinking of the differences there. Like, do I need a test against M365 or do I need a test against Azure? Do I need both? And really, the answer is probably both or M365. Most people are on M365. Azure is when you start to pull in the actual infrastructure pieces of it. So M365 is going to be the SaaS. Entra ID is essentially under M365 as well. It's technically a platform as a service. This little bottom description here I pulled from the Microsoft site. And if you grab the PDF for the slides, I know one of the PDFs that they're going to post out has the notes section from the slide deck. And in the notes section, I have links to all sorts of resources. So I have links to essentially where I pulled this from. I have links to some diagrams, to other Microsoft resources, to other pen testing resources, to GitHub repos, kind of everything that's on the slide. But so M365 and Entra ID is where most clients are when they think Azure Cloud. If we go beyond that, we're starting to do DevOps in Azure. We're starting to use buckets. We're starting to do build code repos. We're hosting applications. All of that's going to be the Azure piece. And we'll look at the differences of what can we look at from an M365 perspective for recon? What can we look at from an Azure perspective for recon on both authenticated and unauthenticated recon? So if we want to break that down a little bit more, just one more Microsoft slide, and I think I'm done with Microsoft slide. There's one more I can think of, but there's not a lot of Microsoft slides in this, except this one too. I just want to break out some of those services and where they fit into the line. So you can reference this to say, where in the Microsoft ecosystem am I working? What am I looking at? That's why I included this one here. So just more of a reference. So if we actually jump into the recon portion of what we're doing, we can start kind of the very beginning, DNS records, right? Anytime you're looking at recon, you're going to be looking at DNS. So if we start here, we can look at the DNS, the text records specifically, and there's going to be two different text records that I can think of that are going to be effective for us. One of them is going to be as soon as you register a Microsoft tenant and you go and you say, I want a custom domain, it's going to pop up and say, you need to authorize your domain. So with that domain authorization, they want you to set an MS equals value as a text record. So here's one example of a redacted domain where they had a redacted, again, Microsoft MS value. So if you see that in a DNS text record, at some point, they went in, they likely said, I want to register this domain as a custom domain within Azure, and Microsoft gave them that value to add to the text record. The other one we can look at is, are they using M365 services for email? So Exchange Online, Exchange Everything is considered the M365 side of the house, not the Azure side of the house. And that's going to be through, for example, an SPF record. Maybe we see the SPF record for protection.outlook.com authorizing Microsoft's outlook.com to send email for that domain, right? So we can kind of look at these from a text record perspective. And similarly to the SPF record, we'd have the MX record, so the mail record. So if we hit the mail record, do we see that mail.protection.outlook.com? Now, I have a little note here, and we're going to get to this soon. Beware of false negatives. So just because you look at the MX record and you don't see mail.protection.outlook.com doesn't mean that mail isn't working on that tenant. Whenever you sign up for a tenant and you start adding different resources in there, mail is technically running on that tenant. So we'll dig into that shortly here. Actually, shortly, I moved the slide. So direct send. So when we look at that MX record, in this case, on this slide, I have this mail.protection.outlook.com. And Steve, a tester here at BHIS, wrote a really good blog post on direct send. And if you look at the notes in the slide, I've got a link out to the spoofing Microsoft 365, like it's 1995 blog post that he wrote. And specifically, he digs into spoofing mail records through direct send, which is one of the Outlook mail connectors. Now, the reason I say caution here is whenever I'm doing a Microsoft assessment or an Azure assessment for a client, I will go ahead and attempt direct send, whether they have this mail.protection.outlook.com or not. I will attempt to manually NS lookup, do we have the domain-tld.microsoft.protection.outlook.com? If that exists, it means that M365 services are running Exchange in the background. So we can actually still attempt to do a direct send to that client in our case, or to that, your company, whatever it might be, and see if we can get through. Now, misconfigurations in the mail rules will sometimes still allow that direct send message to go directly, even though SPF does not allow it. So I've actually seen instances where I've spoofed a mail record. It's gone directly to the internal side. There's no spam controls at all because they're not using the built-in Microsoft spam controls. And there was no exchange rule, mail rule, transport rule to actually forward that to a spam system either. So I've actually seen cases where we could directly attach like executables, send them into the company, and have users click on them to get shells back. So it's almost more dangerous when the company's not aware that this is running in the background. And I see that, I don't want to say frequently, but more often than we should. To send a direct message, I have that text here. It's also in the slide there. And you just send it to whichever, domain resolved. The other thing I've seen is some clients set up essentially like a mail forwarder from domain A to domain B. So we'll forward a message in or direct send a message in, and it gets picked up by that mail forwarder, and it still gets sent through, forwarded essentially to another domain because of internal trust that they have, maybe some internal DKIM records or something else that they have set up. So always a good thing to look at and check. Manual discovery. So looking at the vast items here, the reason why a lot of manual discovery works with Azure is essentially we have these static base URLs examples here. So if you're looking at blob storage, it's always going to be some Microsoft, some customer name, storage account, .blob.core.windows.net. And then same with table storage, queue storage, and more. These are just examples. There's more than I have listed here on the slide. So essentially anything that will brute force a subdomain is how you can access different, or find rather, different storage accounts, different table storage, queue storage, Azure files, database, web, which isn't listed here, and others. I've got a tool coming up next slide, I think, that will show that. Also, we can use Google Dorks. So we can kind of go, I don't want to say old school, but I remember doing Google Dorks like 20 years ago, right? So we can go through and we can hit that static base URL, for example, blob.core.windows.net, and search it for some keyword with Google as well. So if we go forward, we've got Cloud Enum. So Cloud Enum is going to programmatically take that last slide and kind of assess keyword against everything that's here. Now, Cloud Enum will do more than just Azure. So it can do AWS and it can do GCP, but because we're talking Azure, I have the flags to disable the AWS and disable GCP in this example command, right? So if we run Cloud Enum with a keyword, it's going to take that keyword that we put in, and it's going to check all of these different kind of base static URLs with that keyword that we have. So over here, I took an example a couple days ago of a blob that I knew existed, and I put that in as a keyword. And we can see Cloud Enum went through, essentially uses this mutations and brute list here, and attempts this keyword with some fuzzing against those static URLs. The very first check is Azure storage accounts. So it checked through there. It took 18 seconds to go through that phase. And then we have this open Azure container, found it, and it listed out the blob, and then it found the static bucket within that actual container. And we're going to dig into how buckets are set up just slightly with a Microsoft graph to kind of show how those storage accounts versus blob data is. And here it started listing off the files. And there were a lot of files in this specific bucket. I think these were intended to be public in this specific one, but I redacted it just to protect the innocent. So if we look at how blob storage is actually set up within Microsoft Cloud Services, which would be the Azure side, you start off with an account. And this is actually a snippet from a Microsoft site. I've got the reference in the notes slide, portion of the slide. So you start off with an account, we'll call it Sally. That's like your storage. Then you set up containers inside of that storage, and that'd be like your essentially blob bucket storage. And in this case, you might have like pictures or movies or something else. Then you end up with the actual blob data, the actual files, right? Now, if you don't want to go off and attempt a bunch of keywords, there is a website, greyhatwarfare.com, and they actually kind of go out and do a lot of this for you. And with a free account, unregistered free account, you can go off and you can just click on Azure Blob Storage, for example, and start to look at what different buckets are out there, what the containers' names are, backup or pictures or movies or whatever it might be within that bucket. And then you can actually click on the link to see the files, and it'll list all of the different files that they found in that specific blob storage within that storage account. Another thing we can look at is ADFS, so Active Directory Federated Services. So there's a manual URL you can go to within Microsoft. It's the login.microsoftonline.com get user realm. And this email address, some domain.tld here that you would replace with any email, it just has to match the domain. So you can say no one at whatever domain you're testing. And you're going to get two different items that might pop up here. You're going to get is federated false, which means you're using the Microsoft 365 Entra ID, essentially. And that might be joined, on-prem, cloud joined, might be dual purpose, something else. But regardless, you know that they're using those services. The other option is you might get, hey, this auth URL is federated. So is federated true? It's going to give you some auth URL likely to an IDP, wherever their identity provider URL is. And this will give you a little bit of information from the standpoint of, are they federated with some other third-party service like Okta or something else? And then Active Directory, Azure Active Directory internals. So it used to be called Azure Active Directory. They since changed the name to Entra ID. But AAD internals is still a tool that we use for that. So I just ran this get help invoke AAD int recon as outsider to pull off an example to throw in this slide. If I'm running it against a client, I typically just run this very, very quickly to get an idea from a high level perspective of what is on this domain. And the FT is just the same as format table in PowerShell. I'm just shortening it to FT. And we get a lot of information, including things like the tenant ID. So now we have this tenant ID, which we will need for other tools. Sometimes when we're executing certain commands, we'll need to specify the tenant ID. So a very quick and easy way to get that is right here. This desktop SSO enabled. In this example, it's false. When we get to password spraying later, I'm going to talk about this specific case if this were true. And more often than not, this desktop SSO is enabled in tenants, from what I see at least. Here's another example down here. We can see if they're federated or if they're managed, same as the previous slide that I just went through, but this will give us the actual auth URL portal and tell us whether they're federated or managed. And then additionally with AAD internals is going to give us list of other URLs, other domains rather, that we may not have been aware of that the company is tied to somehow. So within the Azure Active Directory in Entra ID format, that specific domain is tied to that tenant somehow. So we can get lists of additional resources to go back and re-recon against too. So let's look at username enumeration, probably one of the more fun and interesting, valuable things we can get from M365 services relatively easily. Now, Microsoft does not find username enumeration as a vulnerability. They say, no, username enumeration is not. So there was quite a bit of debate about this many, many years ago. And they've held against that. And I mean, it, I guess makes sense to some degree, but only if you're a big company like Google or Microsoft can you get away with saying username enumeration's not a vulnerability. So first we can start off, we could just do straight normal manual enumeration. So if we go with manual enumeration, it's literally just hit that login.microsoftonline.com site and we type in a email address. So let's just say it's kevin@test.com. If kevin.test.com returns me to now requesting password from the same style Microsoft login box, it's probably just a managed instance at that point. So looking at M365 services. If it, however, redirects me and points me to an IDP server, well, now we know that it's a federated instance. The other instance that we'll sometimes see is if you type in a URL, or sorry, an email address and hit submit, you'll get a pop-up and it'll say, is this your work or school account, or is it your personal account? It's essentially the difference between being tied to the company tenant or tied to a personal account. And that will actually pop up before the IDP instance because the personal side would be managed through like essentially Microsoft's internal version of M365, whatever they're using for that backend auth. So it has to come up before the IDP because the IDP is only going to be for work or school. That's how it's configured. So those are kind of the different scenarios that I've personally seen from a manual enumeration phase. Now, username lists. If you haven't used, I highly recommend statistically likely usernames. Now, this is older. I think this is last updated like seven years ago, I think, maybe a little older. It's in the GitHub repo. You can check it out, but it was basically taken from census results. I tried finding a newer census list and what this used. I didn't see any with some quick searching a couple days ago. But so we're stuck with this unless you find a better list, let me know. But essentially this johnsmith.txt has roughly 250,000 examples. This is that johnsmith.txt file. Now, obviously we have to know the email scheme being used by the company. There are a couple ones here. So we have like john.smith. So first dot last, first name dot last name for roughly 250,000. I think it's 246,000 and change. usernames. And then we've got a couple other formats here. Some of these formats are smaller, so just be aware of what you're doing. But regardless, you can use some quick Python or Bash or PowerShell or anything else to cut this list up to format it to however you want. What I really, really, really like about statistically likely usernames is I will commonly find a couple hundred extra usernames in large organizations that did not previously have through other recon results. So we're essentially brute forcing username lists. It doesn't perform an authentication with the tool that we'll be using this against coming up here. So have at it, right? It does take a little while to run through. I think, I'm trying to remember how long it took last time I ran it, but it was probably a couple hours to run through and test the 250,000 against a specific instance. Now, I didn't cover Azure Recon from the standpoint of like compromised credentials. Obviously, there's going to be some form of compromised credentials that are out there that you might be able to get access to through various sources. Obviously, use those emails as well, and just append those emails to the username list that you're using, like this one. That way, you get coverage from the standpoint of the statistically likely, along with the previously breached. Right. So just a side note there. Now, if we look at the statistically likely usernames, this is one place where you could use those. I've got, I think, 3 different tools that I'm showing some enum, potential enum with. So the first one would be OneDrive enumeration. So we can actually, OneDrive enum, you can feed it a list of users, and it will go through and attempt to access OneDrive, essentially another static URL that Microsoft uses for those usernames. In this case, I just had a test tenant set up. I threw in an invalid account with 17 valid ones, and we have 18 tested and 17 were valid. It'll actually write out what those 17 emails were to a list for us to use later. Now, there is a caveat to OneDrive enumeration, and that is, depending which Microsoft 365 services have been used by the user, in most cases, likely used, likely valid, but there are cases where a OneDrive URL might not be made. And I haven't manually went through and tested each of these cases, but this is what they have on their GitHub page for OneDrive enum, specifying which Microsoft 365 services will create the OneDrive URL. I know in the case of these 17 valid ones here, I had just stood up and created brand new users. They did not have any interaction at all, and they were still found as valid, tested valid. So it might just be even the fact that there was a license assigned. It now activated it. I'm not quite sure on that. There's definitely some more research that should be done there. And then Teams enum. So Teams enum will go through and attempt to enumerate through Microsoft Teams. Now, the advantage to doing Teams enum, and typically I'll go through and I'll do some other enum first and then follow up with Teams enum once I have a more standard list of users. Authorize like known valid list of users. It just takes a little bit longer in my experience. But you have to give Teams enum a valid business account. You have to have a valid like E5 license on, I don't know, it has to be E5, but you have to have a valid Microsoft license with a Teams license on a business account. And then specify a prompt for your password and give it a list of users. Now, what you're doing is you're actually going from your tenant, or whichever tenant you're giving it in as this username, to the remote tenant, your target. And what's happening is you're using your Teams subscription to attempt to reach out to their tenant. And the reason you have to do that is a personal Teams license doesn't work with the enumeration side. So it's not going to work the same. So you do have to have a valid license essentially at that point, whether it be a demo license or a developer license or something else. But the advantage to Teams enum is it'll actually give us user information. So in this case right here with this redacted.com, we can see the user exists, but the full user details cannot be fetched. We can alternatively sometimes see user status, like they're away, they're online, they're out of office. So we can actually get these, the different teams, notification statuses of users remotely. If you actually go into the admin portal and you look at the settings that Teams has for external domains, external communication, these are the 4 different settings that you're going to see here. Changing these settings does not necessarily block Teams enum from finding that a user exists. It will, however, change other settings that you might get through Teams enum. Now, that's not to say, we're talking Teams enumeration here. There's lots of other ways we can enumerate users. So the fact that you're blocking, full user details is likely enough. But from just a general standpoint of Microsoft, Teams, M365 Teams, obviously you don't want any user to be able to reach out to your internal users. It's relatively common that we'll reach out to users over Teams and send them like, a phishing URL or something else. I guess you call it like Teams phishing. I don't know. But I mean, we'll reach out and we'll talk to users. We'll stand up on Microsoft that looks similar to your domain, and then try to hit users that way. So by default, Teams is just allow all external domains. I don't think I have a screenshot of it, but like the Teams default is basically as open as could possibly be in a brand new tenant. So you kind of need to go through and lock those down. And then we're going to look at CredMaster from a username enumeration. So there's a lot of things we can do with CredMaster. We can do user enumeration. We can do password spraying. We can do a few other tasks. I'm going to cover user enumeration first here, and then we'll jump over to password spraying with it. But in general, CredMaster uses Fireprox. If you're not familiar with Fireprox, I don't have a link out to it, but if you just Google GitHub Fireprox, it'll pop up. What Fireprox does is it stands up an AWS API endpoint. It allows every single request made to that API endpoint to redirect through a AWS IP address pool. And every single time you hit that endpoint, it's going to cycle the AWS backend IP that's being used. So essentially what this looks like is if we're doing username enumeration, every single username lookup is going to come from a different AWS IP address by using Fireprox. When we get to password spraying, this gets especially interesting, and we'll talk about that coming up. But we can enumerate with O365 enum, this specific plugin. So this command here will use CredMaster to enumerate O365 against some domain. We do have to specify, again, the AWS access key and AWS access secret access key here. Then we can output those to maybe email.log or whatever you want. CredMaster will append dot or dash credmaster.txt when it creates that log file. So here we can just see two valid usernames, completed enumeration. I just threw 2 in as a test to get the screenshot. This does not perform authentication for the username enumeration. Then if we move and we look at CredMaster for password spraying. So there's something I want to point out about CredMaster password spraying. So I just specified it's going to be using Fireprox, right? Now, that does create somewhat of a signature in the log file. So in this case, password spraying with CredMaster, I'm going to use the plugin MSOL for this example here. We specify domain. We got the access keys here for Fireprox. Password per delay. You can actually, so if you have a really, really long word list, so you've got 20 different words that you want to spray, you can actually say, in this case, I'm just doing 1 password per delay. I'm saying a delay of 67 minutes, a jitter of 1, and then I'm specifying the users list, whatever that password list is, and then output to some log file again. CredMaster will error if this is a duplicate. So if you just did enumeration with emails log and now you're repassing the spray, it's going to error out. Let's make sure you're using a unique name there. But the interesting kind of fingerprint that's left in the log file is you're users are probably not typically logging in as AWS from an AWS IP space. So if you go into your Entra ID monitoring sign-in logs, you can actually look at the sign-in logs and see different items occurring there from the standpoint of AWS authenticated login, right? Or failure. If you see failure after failure after failure of login, different users, you know that it's likely that something like Fireprox is being used to spray users as a fingerprint. So definitely look at that from a rule standpoint of something you should be exporting these logs and viewing those, reviewing them. Now, I was playing with CrudMaster, kind of getting ready for this, and I decided to try the plugin MSGraph. So I threw in the plugin MSGraph, very similar to the password spraying that we previously saw. And I got a different error message here. So you can see I'm using Fireprox. I'm going through USDs 2 for these. We got these 2 different failure codes: invalid username or password for admin at this company, and then failure, this AAD STS error code, Azure Active Directory STS error code. I actually have on the notes for this slide deck the link out to all of the different various AAD error codes. But in this case, we see request body must contain the following parameter: client assertion, client secret. This was a valid login. It's just CrudMaster didn't know how to handle this specific error message. So if you're spraying and you're getting different error codes, different results, and this applies to any tool, not just this, but dig into what that error code specifically means. In this case, I could use this for validating credentials as well, but I'm going to be getting different error codes out of it. Just a heads up on that part. So then if we go back and we look at CrudMaster for password spraying, I previously mentioned using AAD int recon as outsider. If we look at this desktop SSO enabled, if this was true, we can use the Azure SSO plugin with CrudMaster. So it's another different endpoint that we can password spray against Azure. So just yet another example. So we got creds. I don't know if you saw it right back here. We've got this Adele V at some domain with yet another weak password, one bang. So let's go ahead and just do a quick exploitation on that user. So we're going to look at, does that user have multi-factor? There's a lot of things that contribute to multi-factor being enabled within M365 and within Azure. And we're going to dig into a few of those coming up here, but let's just check the account. So I took the Adele user here, and I used find me access, which I've got links to say what endpoints can we hit with the Adele V user that do not require multi-factor authentication. Now, I had previously configured this user. This user had no multi-factor setup. Okay, they didn't have any. So over here we see true, 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 kind of all over the place. This is a little summary graph for the resources and the number of accessible client IDs that you're going to get. What we tend to see if we find a valid account in the wild is we'll tend to find a couple of these accessible client IDs. And it might be something like maybe you can access Outlook over, one of the different resources with a mobile user agent string or something. So we can actually go through and see, hey, if we're using a mobile user agent string, we can access that. So then we can go through and exploit it from that standpoint. And that's because, well, mobile users don't want to type in multi-factor, right? I get it, but we need to have that, right? So you can kind of do a quick assessment on your own company from this with permission, with perspective to, are there any applications that are allowed through that maybe we need to go through and check in the rule set of why that's allowed through. MFA Sweep, another tool from BHIS that Bo wrote. MFA Sweep does similar. MFA Sweep's been around for a long time. If you do the standard invoke MFA Sweep with the username, whatever it might be, it'll go through and you'll do, I think, roughly 10 different checks And here you can see the specifications of like M365 with Linux user agent string, Android user agent, iPhone, etc. It'll say whether it was allowed or not. He just updated in the last like week, I want to say, or two, to start brute forcing client IDs. I don't want to take his thunder. I don't know if he's talking about this later. I just told him, hey, I'm going to bring that up, and he didn't object. So there is with MFA sweep, you can now invoke brute client IDs. You can specify a username and a password. It does require specifying password. It won't pass through and prompt auth like MFA sweep will currently. So you have to specify it. And we'll see down here, we're testing a client ID, and it'll go through and check whether or not we're valid. So the additional thing that I noticed that Bo's doing with this, which I literally was playing with this, I think last night, was he'll actually save the token off. So if we look at it from the perspective of find me access, to my knowledge, it's not saving any of these tokens off. So with MFA sweep in this access tokens, we end up with a list of, hey, here's valid tokens and refresh tokens for that authenticated login. So we can actually go through and steal that token and just move with it right away. Now, from a logging standpoint, if we go back and we go to Entra ID, we look at the monitoring sign-in logs. This is one very, very small snippet of a find me access against that Adele user. So we can see within, this is actually less than a 2-second window because there was some above and some below this. But we see all of these successful logins for different endpoints that were being tested. Success fail. So gives us an idea to some degree, again, another fingerprint that someone was running some sort of a find me access, an MFA spray, some sort of brute force. Is there MFA enabled within these logs? So if we jump in, look at find me access, I'm going to generate, find me access will allow you to generate tokens. So I used find me access and I specified, give me a token for the Microsoft Graph API. And let's just do Microsoft Azure PowerShell. What this looks like is here. We see the resources graph.microsoft.com. And we get the EY, the JWT essentially access token. Now, again, this allows us to take the specific resource and client and pull a token for that resource and that client. So you might not get, standard permissions. Like if you just use your normal user account, you're going to get, and you have the multi-factor token and you enter it into a tool, you're going to get a lot more potentially permissions than you would getting specific client IDs and endpoints. But nonetheless, we can generate those specific items and work on exfiltrating. So if we look at JWT tokens, these are snippets. These are snippets from jwt.io of this decoded token that we got in the last slide. So we can see it's actually, sorry, this is for, this is for, I might have grabbed the wrong screenshot for this, but regardless, we can take this specific access token, and I don't think it was this access token because this was the graph endpoint. I pulled the next screenshot and showed it in the jwt.io. So this token that I decoded in jwt.io was for outlook.office.com. And we can see it had the app display name. So it was a Microsoft Teams app ID token for that Adele user. This slide here, this token example, where I generated a token for Outlook with the Teams ID here, that's what I was showing on that previous slide. So token setup, if we generate this token and we copy everything between the quotes for the access token, so we get the EY J0EX JWT token ID, we go through and we save that as tokens.txt on a Windows host. When we jump to that Windows host, we can use a tool like teamfiltration.exe, and we can specify that token and we can exfil all. So I just set up a very sample, kind of a demo scenario where I had an admin email Adele, or whatever the name is, Adele, and gave the password in an email. So by running this exfil all, we can see, and Team Filtration does support Fireprox. In this specific screenshot here, I decided not to use it. So I said I was an adult. Yes, I am. It's just a demo. but it does allow using that if you configure it. So recommended if you're doing this on an actual test. So here we can see that it parsed the user and it found and exfiltrated emails from Outlook. In this case, 2 emails were found. If we go to that demo folder that we specified in the out path, we can see the user Outlook emails, open up one of those emails, and we say, please don't tell anyone this time. Here's your password, right? So we'd actually get a list of multiple emails here if they had more than just one email. Now, Teams filtration can do a lot of the other stuff that we've already talked about. It can do user enum. It can do password spraying. It can do kind of everything. I want to give you that piecemeal. Here's other tools that do it. Here's another tool that does it. It just depends on the scenario you're in. Team filtration is a Windows tool. CredMaster and others are Linux tools. So you kind of have to, pick the tool for the job. So one note I will say about team filtration, you have to use that proper token. If you're using a token that doesn't have permissions to what you're trying to exfiltrate, it's just going to show an empty directory. It'll have, within that demo directory, it's going to have like the local database for team filtration that was generated, but it's not going to have any data. And it doesn't mean that the data is not there. It just means that that specific token didn't have access to that data. Right? So just do be aware, depending on what that token has access to. So MFA checks. Excuse me. So there's a lot of different ways that you need to check your instance, your Azure, your M365 instance for MFA. So I pulled out a few examples here from this test domain, test tenant that I was using. And one of the things was authentication requirement, single factor. So if we actually go to Entra, we go to the sign-in logs, manage the sign-in logs. We can create a filter. We can add filter here, and we can choose authentication requirement. Then we can click here and we can choose single factor authentication. We can see our users using single factor authentication, actively using it. Not that it's available, just it's actively being used. So this is kind of one of those scenarios where management comes to you and says, well, we can't disable it because people use it all the time. Well, maybe they do, maybe they don't. You can actually go in and start auditing that, start checking, is this actively used? It gives you awareness, situational awareness to the risk that you have, right? And then from there, you need to work on how do we weed it out? How do we get rid of it? Was it a mistake? Maybe you intended to have it. Also, where are they logging in from? It's not in this little snippet here, but you'll have, the IP address, user agent string, a bunch of other kind of metadata to this actual authenticated login. Another place you can go is within identity protection. You can actually say require that multi-factor authentication registration on user setup. Now, I have a little bit of heartburn with this. Yes, it's a good setting to have. You need to have it set. However, I cannot count the number of times when we as testers find an active account that's not actively used by a user that we password spray successfully and we set up the multi-factor for the user, right? So I'm not aware of anything in Azure that as an active configuration option, right? So M365, I said Azure, M365 is limited in what we can do. You could programmatically like create a PowerShell script to go in and audit it. But I really wish M365 had like, if user has not set up multi-factor in X number of days, disable the account. Maybe there's an option in there. I haven't seen it, but regardless, it's a nice thing to consider for you. How long have these accounts been active, and do they have MFA yet? If they don't have MFA, really the question is why, right? It's obviously not used, or they never log into Azure, M365. They never log into those services. Do they need those services? Can you remove them from those services? And then another item that might be caused with this authentication requirement, one of these other kind of metadata fields is conditional access policies. Now, this test tenant that I was using was set up with just the Microsoft security defaults. Microsoft security defaults do not use conditional access, right? They have these kind of default configuration without conditional access. Now, I thought this was really interesting. So I went to the conditional access with an Entra ID, and I knew that this box was here where it says see all unprotected sign-ins. Now, notice it says 0 users signed in during the last 7 days without any policy coverage. Yes, that's true. There was no conditional access policy coverage. But if I had conditional access policy coverage enabled, this number would tell me essentially how many unprotected sign-ins there were with single-factor authentication also. So it's kind of Microsoft's math number. I don't know if that was just like a bug that should be fixed, or if it's just the verbiage needs to be changed to 0 signed in the last 7 days using conditional access policies. I don't know. If I actually clicked the see unprotected sign-ins, these user logs were also shown as obviously unprotected sign-ins. So just a bit of an oddity there. So I recommend, even if it says 0, click the box and check, right? But one of these reasons for the single factor authentication is, again, we find conditional access is like its own topic. We could probably talk about it for an hour someday, right? These rules get very, very complex. And sometimes just adding certain applications in, not thinking about it, or adding certain exceptions to the conditional access policies start to create these holes, much like we saw in traditional firewalls, right? Or on-prem firewalls, where one rule kind of goes further than it should and takes over a bunch of other items. So we tend to find those as the tricky issues. It didn't require all Microsoft applications, for example, or all Microsoft resources to use, to require multi-factor authentication. All right. So time check, we're a little low, but we'll keep going. We got a little bit of time here. So authenticated recon. Once you have credentials, right? And this could be from the attacker's perspective or your perspective auditing your own organization or checking, validating your own organization. There's some quick wins with credentials. One of the utilities I really like is just O365 Recon. O365 Recon, when you import it, it's going to just prompt you for credentials. You pop in the credentials, and it's going to quickly give you some CSVs and text files here of kind of overall layout of the LAN. It's just a one-time shot, very quick, gives you that user list. Now, we could take this users list that we have. Once we have one authenticated user, now we can take this list and we can go back to that password spraying. Now that we have all valid users within the company as of the time of pulling that snapshot, right? And I like to go back and cycle back through those credentials again, and potentially hit more with those basic creds. Road Recon. Road Recon takes a little bit more time to run, but it's going to go through and it's you have to authenticate with a device code. Once you authenticate with that device code, again, provided you have the multi-factor auth, or you can somehow gather it a different way. Then we can run gather, and it'll give us a nice web page with like users, groups, devices, just kind of a really great dump of that, again, data from M365 and Azure. And then AzureHound. We all love Bloodhound on-prem, so we have to talk about AzureHound. So AzureHound, once we have those credentials again, we can run that against the tenant. It's going to go through, and then again, this was that test tenant that I had. It only had 18 users. It was not set up for really anything here. But it's going to go through and it's going to pull a lot of Azure objects out. And there's some really, really interesting attacks. And this is a recon discussion, so I'm not going to dig into those attacks because number one, time, certainly. And number two is it's a whole different topic. But there's a lot of really interesting attacks within AzureHound that you can query from a tenant perspective. So go through, pull the AzureHound, start to look through what those objects are, and potentially how you can elevate in that tenant. GraphRunner, another BHIS tool. So get graph tokens will pop up and prompt for device code authentication. When you get that graph token, these are the default permissions on the graph token. Sometimes when you run get graph tokens, the screenshot I have here is just kind of the standard Microsoft M365 default tokens. Sometimes when you run it, if the user's restricted on what they can do with the graph token, you're going to see a lot less permissions here. So I was just talking with another tester a couple days ago. They had like 2 permissions in here. It was like user read, and that was it, or something. Like it had almost no standard permissions. So do double check what permissions are included within that token. So we can run like get Azure AD users with the tokens, dollar tokens, and go through and query again the users from that tenant. We can save it out to a file. Some of my favorite things are kind of go-to things with GraphRunner is this permission enum. It goes through and it executes, and it shows you a lot of the M365 settings, a lot of the tenant settings that are set up. So you can look at things like, can users create groups? Can users, trying to think of some of them, invite guest users, different items like that. The other thing here is dump caps. So caps is those are those conditional access policies that we talked about, right? So we can actually dump the conditional access policies and start to go through and review them and find, oh, hey, did you know that there's an exception in this caps policy, maybe for, even for something like Teams or Outlook or something else? Maybe we can go and request a specific token for that. Now, if you remember, running Find Me Access and MFA Spray, they've got fingerprints, right, in the logs of multiple logins. So if we're able to, maybe we just run GraphRunner first. It's one login, right? And then we go through and we dump those caps if we're trying to be sneaky about it. And now we go through those caps and see, is there any way that we can bypass this rather than going through and hitting it with a sledgehammer with a Find Me Access or something? Obviously getting the users, that's the screenshot here. Get updatable groups. So it's possible that there's groups that you as a user can add yourself to that you aren't currently in. So I like to get those groups, and then actually there's another command for it, but I like to then add myself to all of those groups to see what other juicy data is out there. I've done this on a couple clients and ended up getting some really, really nice high fidelity things like credentials for other accounts. Complete domain takeover. Get dynamic groups. Dynamic groups are it's almost like conditional access policies. It's a whole nother thing. It's essentially conditions that are set to add you to a group. So sometimes you can find certain conditions that you might be able to manipulate that then add you to a new group. So maybe like admins contain administrator in the username or something. And you can also invite guest users, and you can have administrator in the username, right? So you could then invite a guest user with administrator in the username, with a username that contains administrator or something, invite that guest user, come in and now get added automatically to that role. So dynamic groups are worth looking at. And then obviously searching SharePoint and OneDrive for sensitive and valuable data. Scout Suite. I wouldn't run, this is another sledgehammer tactic, right? But Scout Suite is great for internal teams who are trying to do essentially like an audit or a security check against their own tenant. Now, Scout Suite does require subscriptions to run. Okay, so when we look at something like GraphRunner, the user doesn't need a subscription because all you're touching is Microsoft 365 stuff, really. Scout Suite is heavily focused on really the Azure side of the house. So you need those subscription resources, which is Azure. And anytime you're looking at Azure, you've got a subscription for it. It's looking at those subscriptions and pulling out key data for that and then running an audit against that. So it creates essentially a website. And you can come up and you can run JQ against, there's a couple JSON files that are output by Scout Suite. You can just run JQ against them, but it also creates a dynamic website. And you can go through and click through. If you were to click on, say, network, It would take you to the different checks that were run. There's maybe some green boxes, some yellow boxes, and some red boxes. And this network one might be like there's a network access rule that allows everything outbound. In fact, whenever I'm testing a client, I tend to find cloud hosted, like in Azure, AWS domain controllers. For whatever reason, like to, you can chalk 445 outbound on those more frequently than I'd like to admit. So there's always that. But Scout Suite, I highly recommend running it from an internal perspective. Or if you're as a tester, you just want to hit the sledgehammer. I have seen this detected a couple times, very, very rarely, which shows us that there's a huge lack between taking these fingerprints and applying them within companies. PowerZure, another great, I like to use this for the operational post-op stuff within Azure, like dumping credentials out, dumping run books, and those kinds of things. There's two more things I wanted to hit, and I know we're close on time. So number one is benchmarks. Look at the CIS benchmarks. Look at the other benchmarks that are out there to learn how to kind of audit and modify your configuration. M365 has a ton of defaults that are really, really, really weak. And if you go through and you hit this was a screenshot from actually like 2019. There were 60 different recommendations. I know there's more today in those benchmarks. Attack has a whole separate framework for that as well. And the last piece that I have here is practice, right? Practice makes perfect. You got to practice. A lot of us maybe are thinking, I can't practice this. I don't have an Azure tenant. So there is a Microsoft developer program. If you have a Visual Studio Pro license or an enterprise subscriber, you can get a free developer license. You essentially go to developer.microsoft, click here, click join now, and you can actually create a developer program. Takes a phone number. You can add these sample data packs for users. It'll add like, I think 17 default users, and you can add mail. It gives you full licenses. You can do Teams, you can do Outlook, you can do kind of everything that you just saw here in the slide deck today. So highly recommend doing that.
Oh,
that's all I got.
Jason's muted.
All right.
There we go. Welcome.
Kevin, well done. It was Kevin's first Black Hills Information Security webcast. Thank you for coming here today, sharing your knowledge about how to do reconnaissance for Azure. We do have questions, but we'll get to them in some post-show banter. So we're running out of official time. So Kevin, if you could sum up everything today in one final thought, for people to take with them, what would it be? Situational awareness. Run this against yourself if you get permission to. See what's out there. Be aware of what others can see about you without knowing it. Like AAD and Recon is outsider. It's going to show you those other domains attached that you might not, you think are hidden, you don't know about. MFA, and double check that you actually have executed MFA properly within your tenant. So thank you so much for joining us today on this Black Hills Information Security webcast. We'll stick around for a couple minutes to do Q&A. But if you joined us today, thank you so much. If you forgot to do Hack It inside Discord, so it's got to be live during the webcast in Discord. If you engaged at all today, you did get credit for it. If you have like a little storm cloud next to your name, you're good to go. But if you didn't check in for Hack It, and if you don't know what Hack It is that every 10th webcast, 10th and 20th, 30th, 40th, and 50th webcast, we send you a reward in the mail. And you're like, really? Something in the mail? Yes, it does arrive to you. It comes to your mailbox. It's fantastic. So make sure that you check in for Hack It. And thank you so much for being a part of this community. We hope that you engage between the webcasts. So stick around inside of Discord. Ask whatever questions you have. Ask questions about your career. Ask questions about red teaming or blue teaming or threat hunting. Like there's channels for it. There's room for you to ask your questions. And then there are so many people in the community that would like to share their knowledge with you to help answer those questions. That's how we all get better. That's how our security improves. And that's how the world becomes a better place. So thank you for participating in that. All right. All right. If you do need a red team threat hunt pen test, especially for 2025, now's the time to reach out. All right, now let's move on.
You need to do that again. The blue. You need to add it a little bit after. This is confusing. Yeah,
If
good
you
job,
need a cloud
Kevin.
assessment, we do those too.
Yeah, cloud.
Yes, we do. So we might have missed questions since there were about 1,200 of you here today. So if we did not answer your question, go ahead and pop it again in the Discord and we will ask Kevin.
I did see one question here. Doesn't the developer subscription only last 30 days? So I just signed up like literally 4 days ago, and it gave me 91 days. I heard that this is renewable too. So as long as you continue to use it, it's going to at some point recycle that and pop back in. So just so you're aware.
Someone said, to be a noob, if I understand this correct, if you have an external spam filter, it will not catch the spoof email that he showed earlier in the cast. Also, awesome cast and thanks.
So it really depends on how the mail is set up within the tenant. There's transport rules and there's mail flow rules. A transport rule might take all mail that's received by M365 Exchange and forward it out to that spam filter. There might be a mail flow rule that's actually going to intercept and say, if it meets certain conditions, send it directly. We used to see that really, really commonly with like phishing products. Like I don't want to pick on any one phishing product, but whatever phishing products are out there, they used to say, because you used to not be able to do these granular rules within M365. Back then it was O365 or whatever they called it. These granular rules, and they would say if the mail header contains product name, allow it through the mail filter. So then we can just like create spoofed mail with a mail header and it gets forwarded to users that way as well.
Yeah.
So there's a lot of different configuration in there, but
yeah, I also reshared the blog post by Steve.
Yeah.
For the, just a reminder, if you are currently with Microsoft and you're watching today's webcast, we see you, we appreciate you, and we appreciate the emails that you send afterwards, fact checking and letting us know that this is why you do the things that you do. We enjoy getting those emails and we appreciate it. Thank you, Microsoft. Okay.
Thank you, Microsoft.
So wouldn't Microsoft Defender catch EDA internals or any of the other tools being run once access is achieved?
So once access is achieved, it's a whole different set of rules. So we're really looking at like the risky sign-ins and a few other things. That all depends on configuration. And so when I think about it, I can think of a couple clients, like I could probably count them on my two hands, that have actually detected something like a breach once we've achieved it from that standpoint. I run all day long, like Find Me Access, MFA Spray. That's only ever been detected like once or twice that I can think of. So it's very, very, very dependent on how you have configured those rule sets. And there's a lot of configuration in there that we'd have to dig down to and look at. I'd almost look at the other metadata on the sign-in logs to see what you can filter out from that aspect. But no, Defender, like ATP and the others, out of the box, I haven't seen anything other than that handful of times.
This question was asked a couple times. How do you verify Entra 2FA when using something like Okta?
Well, so I'm not sure if there's anything that is there. We rarely run into an unmanaged instance where we're spraying against that. Every now and then it'll come up. So I actually haven't tried to see what happens if we spray against an instance like that. But just thinking through the different ADFS flow here. So if we can't directly authenticate to M365 Entra, it's going through Okta, then Okta would be the provider. So in that case, if we try to generate a token somewhere else, it should redirect us to Okta, would be my guess. I don't have a demo set up to test it out or try it though.
Sure. Our buddy Jeff McJunkin says, have you used purplecloud.network? Any thoughts or impressions of it?
I have not. Purplecloud.network?
Mm-hmm.
I'll have to take a look.
someone asked how they get CPE credit, and just want to let everyone know that we switched over to a new company called Incredible about 4 months ago. So if you do a search in your inbox for webcast at blackhillsinfosec.com, you should find them in your spam folder, or check your spam folder to see if you need to set up a rule where that comes to your inbox. So all of your, so if you've attended like 7 or 8 of them, then you've gotten credit for all 7 or 8 of them until you actually like go and check your Credible account. So if you're using the same email address for each one of your registrations, then there should be a repository of all your certificates for your Black Hills. Same thing for anti-siphon, same thing for active countermeasures. If you've attended those, it's all in the same repository. So we've been keeping track. And once we get an intern on board, we're going to go retroactively for like the last 3 or 4 years and make sure that you get those too. So, but it is time intensive to make sure. And we also want to make sure that we're not like transferring your data in a way that's insecure. So that's what we're working on.
Couple intern job right there.
Yeah.
Mm.
Question here. How do you decide what needs a tool and what's the process for making them?
So I always heard this, kind of go out and look for a tool for about 15 minutes. If you can't find the tool in 15 minutes, it probably hasn't been written yet, right? So if you're trying to do something very, very specific in there, I mean, there's so many tools I didn't even cover in this deck. There's just not enough time. And I feel bad about some of them, but I just didn't have time. For making them, wow, because so many other people that would be better responding to that. I don't really develop tools. I develop a lot of scripts, right? So I write some quick Python, some quick bash, and kick that out. But for developing a tool, I suppose it's kind of the same, right? Come up with that minimum viable script or tool that works, put it out on GitHub, and ask the community for some feedback. Maybe hit up some people in the Discord chat for that as well. I'm sure there's plenty of developers there.
A good follow-up question is, do you have a course that one could take to learn more about this? Kevin, have you thought about doing a class?
I've thought about it, yeah. So I'm in the process of developing a class right now. I'm probably right around 70% done with it. So I use the base of some of that for this slide deck here on just the intro and recon portion. So yeah, I'm looking at having a 2-day class probably in the next couple months here.
Using Credmaster's MSOL plugin will start triggering Azure Smart Lockout at around 10 failed logins. Have you found a way around this?
Yeah, so great question. I actually meant to bring this up when I was talking on that slide, and I forgot to. So the Fireprox is going to use a unique address from AWS when you're using that. So if you're running Credmaster without Fireprox, it's going to very, very quickly, and I don't know if it's 10. I usually see it around closer to like 40 or 50. You start getting that smart lockout. But by using Fireprox with it, you're going to avoid that smart lockout to a degree. I say to a degree. If you run Credmaster every 67 minutes, like I had in the slide, for about a day, you're going to start getting still smart lockouts in the background. So there's some secret sauce that Microsoft has. We don't know what it is. But after some period of time, they're fingerprinting that to some degree, and we'll start to block it from that standpoint. But yeah, you switch over and start using Credmaster, or not Credmaster, Fireprox with Credmaster.
Anyone know of any defer courses on Azure M365, maybe business email compromise related? I think Derek's working on a business email. No, Patterson Cake's working on a business email compromise course. Okay.
I think
like
that's it.
Yeah. All right. If we didn't get to your question, we apologize. But what Kevin's going to do is take those questions, figure out a way to either potentially future blog post or content for his training class or a future webcast. So thank you so much for asking those questions. And hopefully you got your question either answered by the community or by the others attending. So we appreciate you sticking around. Q&A, this video will be available on YouTube, so you can definitely check it out there. You can look at all of our past videos. And if you go to poweredbybhis.com, it's a new site that we have. You can take a look at all future webcasts that we've already like figured out and planned and prepared. We have webcasts scheduled into 2025 already. Not like in that website, but like
Yeah.
internally we have them. We're still figuring out what the content's going to be and who's going to teach it and all that other stuff. So thank you so much. We'll make sure you get credit today. And if you unlocked a special channel for Hackett, then make sure that you go and get your reward. If you have no idea what I'm talking about, come back to other webcasts and we'll talk about it some more. Deb, anything that you want to say before we get going? Because we have Wabas Hack and Fest coming up. You're the director of kindness and generosity. Anything that you want to say?
No, just thank you. Yeah, I guess I want to say more kind things. Like, thank you for showing up. Thank you for spending your valuable time with us. We know time is almost worth more than money. At least my time is worth more than money. So thank you for sharing an hour with us and being so positive and helpful. Everyone answering questions is always, it warms my heart to see you guys jumping in and answering questions. And thank you, Ryan, for not spotlighting me. I appreciate that.
Kevin, great job. First webcast down. We'll take a look at when you can do another one in 2025 because you did a great job. Well done. Spoke well. Very easy to understand. You broke down complex concepts into small things. We appreciate you. And with that, Ryan, kill it with fire, sir.
Kill it with fire.
Come on, Ryan, kill it.
Do it. Kill it.
You've been waiting this whole
You've been
time just to
waiting
do
this
this one thing.
One job.
Can you teach Kurt
One
to
job.
kill it?